Welcome back to another episode. Make sure you subscribe and watch the video till the end. First people in space. Gagarin was the first person to fly in space, and the first American followed only a few weeks later. Alan Shepard blasted off on Freedom 7 on May 5, 1961. The first female in space was Valentina Tereshkova, a Russian cosmonaut, who flew in space in June 1963. There were several other female cosmonauts selected with her, but none of the others flew. The next woman in space, Svetlana Savitskaya, didn't fly until 1982. The first American woman in space was Sally Ride, who reached space on June 18, 1983 as part of Space Shuttle mission STS-7. For almost 20 years, the Americans and the Soviets were the only nations with astronauts. The first nation outside of those two countries to fly an astronaut was the former Czechoslovakia, which saw Vladimir Remek fly on the Soviet Soyuz 28 mission in 1978. Since then, dozens of nations from all over the world have seen their citizens fly in space on American, Soviet or Russian spacecraft. Oldest person in space. U.S. Senator John Glenn, D. Ohio, was 77 when he flew on Space Shuttle Discovery's STS-95 mission in October 1998. The mission marked Glenn's second space flight. He had become the first American to orbit the Earth back in February 1962. So Glenn holds another record as well, the longest time between trips to space, 36 years 8 months. The oldest woman in space was Peggy Whitson, who was 57 years old during her last flight, Expeditions 50, 51, and 52 in 2016 to 2017. Youngest person in space. Cosmonaut German Titov was 1 month shy of his 26th birthday when he launched into orbit aboard the Soviet spacecraft Vostok 2 in August 1961. He was the second person to orbit the Earth, performing 17 loops around our planet during his 25-hour flight. Titov was also the first person to sleep in space, and reportedly the first to suffer from space sickness, motion sickness in space. Tereshkova was not only the first woman in space, but also the youngest. Her record of 26 years still stands today. Most consecutive days in space. Russian cosmonaut Valery Polyakov spent nearly 438 consecutive days aboard the Mir space station, from January 1994 to March 1995. He therefore holds the record for longest single human spaceflight and perhaps set another one for wobbliest legs when he finally touched down. The most consecutive days in space by an American is 340 days, which happened when Scott Kelly took part in a one-year mission to the International Space Station in 2015-16, along with Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko. The longest single flight by a woman took place in 2016-17, when American astronaut Peggy Whitson spent 288 days aboard the space station. NASA astronaut Christina Koch is scheduled to break that record when she returns from a 328-day mission to the space station in the spring of 2020. Farthest away. The record for the greatest distance from Earth has stood for more than 4 decades. In April 1970, the crew of NASA's Apollo 13 mission swung around the far side of the Moon at an altitude of 158 miles, 254 kilometers, putting them 248,655 miles, 400,171 kilometers, away from Earth. It's the farthest our species has ever been from our home planet. Most total time spent in space. Cosmonaut Gennady Padalka holds this record, with a little more than 878 days accrued over 5 space flights. That's almost 2.5 years, 2 years 4 months 3 weeks 5 days, spent zipping around the Earth at about 17,500 meters per hour. For women, the record is held by NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson, who spent more than 665 days in space. That also happens to be the endurance record for any American astronaut. Longest continuously inhabited spacecraft. This record belongs to the International Space Station, and it grows every day. The $100 billion orbiting lab has been continuously occupied since November 2, 2000. Infographic: the International Space Station, inside and out this span of time plus 2 days, since the first station crew launched October 31, 2000 also marks the longest period of continuous human presence in space. Longest space shuttle mission. The Space Shuttle Columbia launched on its STS-80 mission on November 19, 1996. It was originally slated to return to Earth that December 5, but bad weather pushed the landing back 2 days. When Columbia finally came home, it had spent nearly 17 days and 16 hours in space, a record for a shuttle mission. Most memorable space shuttle missions. Most time on the Moon. In December 1972, Harrison Schmitt and Eugene Cernan of NASA's Apollo 17 mission spent just under 75 hours, more than 3 days, poking around on the surface of the Moon. They also performed 3 moonwalks that lasted a total of more than 22 hours. Perhaps the astronauts lingered because they suspected humanity wouldn't be back for a while. Apollo 17 marked the last time people traveled to the Moon, or even went beyond low Earth orbit. Incidentally, the first moonwalk took place on July 20, 1969, during Apollo 11, when Neil Armstrong stepped outside of the Eagle lunar module. He was shortly followed by his crewmate Buzz Aldrin. The moonwalk lasted a little over 2 hours, 31 minutes, about the same length of a typical Hollywood movie. Most women in space at once. This record stands at 4 women in orbit at the same time. In April 2010, NASA astronaut Tracy Caldwell Dyson traveled to the International Space Station in a Russian Soyuz spaceship. She was soon joined on the orbiting lab by NASA astronauts Stephanie Wilson and Dorothy Metcalf-Lindenberger and Japan's Naoko Yamazaki, who made the trip aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery on its STS-131 mission. Most expensive spaceship. Member nations began building the International Space Station, which is about as long as a football field and boasts as much living space as a 5-bedroom house, back in 1998. It was completed in 2012, although more expansions are in store. The cost for the orbiting lab was estimated at $100 billion in 2011. That makes the station the single most expensive structure ever built. The cost will continue to rise due to more modules and time operating the station. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for our next episode.